As most of you know, we were here 3 weeks ago with a different group of guys that organised the rally. They are here in the audience. Thank you for that. We were here on foot. We're now back here with tractors to make this government listen to us.
This protest felt very different from the last one. Then there was a stage, big names from farming media and celebrities giving speeches. Politicians of all parties came to try and harness the movement. It was like a carnival atmosphere. We all came together, cleaned up after ourselves and went for a pint afterwards. This protest felt a little different. 650 tractors, so fewer people, and a much more grassroots feel. This time, we as farmers ran a protest for ourselves. The speeches were shouted off the back of a pickup parked outside Downing Street. Short and to the point, heartfelt, by working people, for working people.
Secondly, all of those that have brought toys to donate to Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, bring them here, leave them here. They will go on this truck. This truck will be escorted and flanked by tractors to the hospital to deliver them after the protest when we're finished at 3 o'clock. Thank you for all the donations. The children will be grateful.
And I think this was much better. As a group of people, we've never really had a voice. We've talked through the history of agriculture on this channel, and the narrative hardly involves any farmers. But this was something special. We weren't there to listen to politicians, we were speaking for ourselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Webster and I'm the founder of Save British Farming, and I'm not going to say too much because I feel so tearful to see you all here today. And what I want to say to the country on your behalf is, listen to us farmers, we're telling you the truth.
For anybody new, I would like to say that I agree with the stated aims of the inheritance tax, to hit the super wealthy while allowing working farmers to continue. The problem is, it doesn't do that. We have discussed this already in 2 videos. I might make a Farmers versus the Government playlist on the homepage of this channel, as I fear this is just the beginning. In a nutshell, the government are putting a tax on 20% of the value of land over a £1 million threshold. DEFRA, the Rural Ministry, have figures which say the return on capital employed is about 0.5% for farmers. They have 10 years to pay the 20% tax, which is 2% a year, or roughly 4 times farm income, according to the government's own figures. We cannot pay this tax, so we'll be forced to sell up. And I add that this is the average return of investment. 30% of farms made no money last year, which would mean the farmers didn't even earn a wage out of the business.
That's why we're here today. This tax doesn't take into account farm incomes. It just takes into account the value of the farm, which is irrelevant to most of us because we're not going to sell it. We're not militant people by nature, but we are very tough, very resilient. That's why we do the job we do, because no one else would.
Tractors started turning up from 10 AM from as far afield as the Isle of Wight and Leicestershire. We completely filled Whitehall all the way from Parliament back to Trafalgar Square. About 650 in total. A fun little detail about British society I would like to share with you is that there are exemptions against inheritance tax for something called national heritage assets. Buildings, estates or parklands of outstanding historical or architectural interest. In other words, if your generational wealth is so enormous that your family have owned half a county for a few centuries, the government won't take that off you because it's part of our culture that your family owns more than other people and collects rent off all the plebs. The government's pretense that this tax doesn't attack working people is absurd because the super wealthy have exemptions. And their property doesn't get hit by inheritance tax because it's normally stored in trusts or owned by limited companies, and those things don't die.
Can I tell you, when I walked off that tube this morning and seen these tractors, I had tears in my eyes. I had tears in my eyes. Because you know why? Not one of us want to be here. Not one of us deserve to be here. We should be home with our families, watching after our farms, bringing up the livestock, milking our cows, collecting the eggs, getting the veg, fruit to feed the nation.
After the speeches, the tractors did a procession around central London, and the biggest crowd of the day was Londoners who came to see what was happening. The public seemed to have a really good time, waving at us as we drove round. I guess seeing a tractor is a novelty for a lot of people. But as we were going past Parliament, Prime Minister's Questions was taking place, and the leader of the opposition talked about immigration. She didn't mention us at all. And I wonder if that was because she wasn't invited to speak at this protest, and if she can't capitalise on it, she's not interested.
Listen to the people before you go cold and hungry, and it will happen. Food inflation, food shortages, and the poorer people in society will suffer.
We organised then a rally in Canterbury. 250 tractors completely surrounded the city of Canterbury. The public support was tremendous. I don't know what you guys have found today driving into London. Were people tooting? Were they flashing their lights? Were they putting their thumbs up? Of course they were. This country needs us farmers.
While this protest is notionally about the inheritance tax, I think it's worth just running through other things the government are doing, most of which I think are worse than the inheritance tax, but they're not getting talked about because everyone's distracted. So firstly, they've frozen the budget for farming. The government maintains that the £2.4 billion budget is the largest ever budget for farming, but the budget hasn't increased since the last Parliament, so that is a blatant lie. Actually, it hasn't increased since 2014, so in real terms, the budget for farming has gone down every year for the past decade. On top of this, the last 3 years have seen DEFRA not spend all of their budget allocated for farming. This is because the budget is allocated to environmental schemes that are very poorly thought out, so farmers haven't been signing up and the money just hasn't been used. And thirdly, despite the fact they have lots of spare money, DEFRA have capped the basic payments, which were the subsidies from the European cheap food policy that were being phased out. DEFRA is taking them away faster than was agreed. Farmers who had received up to £30,000 will have 76% removed, but anything above that will be cut entirely. They've actually capped the payment at £7,200, which, if you were expecting £100,000, is going to challenge your business model. Fourthly, the farmers who have been cooperating with the government and have been turning to these new environmental schemes that have replaced the post-war cheap food policy have found that DEFRA has frozen the capital grants. This is money for environmental projects, helping boost trees and orchards, water quality, air quality and natural flood defences. It's been stopped. This is a problem because certain jobs can only be done at certain times of year. I know people who are trying to plant new hedges through this scheme and they've lined themselves up with the plants and the labour, but now they have cash flow problems because DEFRA are refusing to do anything until January when it's too late. They're talking about banning manure spreading in the autumn to prevent water pollution, which really deserves its own episode, but muck spreading in the autumn is pretty important. Muck is a tasty snack for the worms and microorganisms. It helps us manage our soil organic content, making the soil healthier and reducing our reliance on synthetic fertilisers, which take a lot of energy to produce, so are very carbon intensive. And muck is absolutely necessary if you want to farm organically, which is what the government seems to want us to do. What you see here is some very well rotted farmyard manure, straw bedding mixed with cow poo, being spread across a field. We also put some digestate onto the field, which is decomposed maize that had been used to generate biogas for power, so another type of organic fertiliser. While there is a small stream running down the side of this field, I am very confident none of this manure got into the water. You can see where the digestate has been spread, it's applied very precisely, dribbled onto the ground, and once it had been put on, we ploughed it into the soil. There, it's not going to run off the surface. Worms and microorganisms will get to work digesting it, and while they do, we can plant the seeds in the ground and roll them in for winter. Muck releases nutrients slowly. It has to be broken down in the soil. But But artificial fertiliser consists of little balls that contain exactly what the plants need, so it can be applied exactly when the plant needs it. Here we see the same crops the following spring when they've grown up, and artificial fertiliser is being spread on them. You couldn't spread muck at this point, even if you wanted to, because it would shred the crop. Muck consists of lots of heavy lumps that are flung at high speed, and muck spreading involves driving all over the field with heavy machines. Earlier this year, there was a court case between environmental group River Action and the Environment Agency. The judge stated that muck spreading should not be allowed if there was no immediate crop need. Besides this, the Office for Environmental Protection has launched an investigation as they think the statutory guidance may be unlawful as some of the wording is not consistent with the regulations themselves. Steve Reed has until mid-January to respond. So the law hasn't been changed, but the rules allow manure spreading based on crop need at the time of application. And you could argue that in autumn there is no crop need for manure because the crop hasn't even been planted yet, as you just saw. This is essentially the argument. While DEFRA's guidance says autumn spreading is acceptable to meet a crop's total need over a full crop cycle, the Environment Agency urges that there is no immediate need for nitrogen at that time of year. So there is a real risk that autumn muck spreading could be banned. This would make it pretty well impossible for muck to be applied on crops. You couldn't use it. Even in this video from the Second World War shows they spread muck before the crop was planted.
Manure goes back into the land to keep it in good heart, as we say.
And it could be even worse than an autumn ban. Of greater concern is if the crop's need for nutrients at the time of application is extended to include phosphate. There is a chance then that all manure applications could be banned, as the low application rates required would be impossible to apply. DEFRA is having a 2-week review of the guidance, to which the NFU have said, "We don't believe you can fulfil a rapid review of something so complicated," which is a fair point. If we had a competent minister, they would come out at this point and say, obviously the law wasn't intended to outright ban muck spreading. If the review finds that that is the case, we will amend the legislation. But we have Steve Reed. We produce about 100 million tonnes of farmyard manure every year, which is put back into the soil. If we're not allowed to put it back into the land, then it will be a waste product. God knows what we'll do with it. There are also lots of very strict rules on how you can store things like muck and slurry, so people are going to have to build new storage facilities, which is very expensive and would require planning permission a lot of the time. And new buildings would increase the value of your land, which would then make all of the inheritance tax stuff worse. And it keeps going. They're talking about banning muck, which means we would rely on artificial fertiliser, so they're going to put an additional tax on that. I understand the sentiment behind a carbon tax on fertiliser, but civilization needs fertiliser to support itself. It seems they want to make farming impossible. The government has also lied to the rural trade associations, the NFU and the CLA, who they explicitly told before the election they wouldn't change inheritance tax, which they then proceeded to do. And Steve Reed said last time we were protesting to a parliamentary committee that we were all stupid. How are we supposed to negotiate in good faith with this? Steve Reed clearly has a disdain for farmers. I have no faith in him and I think he should resign. And lastly, the announcement of the government's national land use strategy has been pushed back until next year. I am very concerned about this. It makes me wonder if the reason they're prepared to tank all of these other things is because they know that they're going to blow them out of the water with a new set of announcements, but they're making us wait for that. I don't know what they're going to come out with, but it's entirely possible they've decided they need land for nature and they need land for housing, and our continued existence is standing in the way of hitting their targets. Especially if this is based on Henry Dimbleby's food strategy, which said that vast swathes of England should not be farmed at all. We have no choice but to wait and see, but it does look like January 2025 is going to be singularly the worst month for British farming ever. I wanted to find the oldest and smallest tractor, but was disappointed to only see one vintage machine. There were a few telehandlers, a few tractors with Christmas decorations, and a few very fancy tractors that were there to show off, I think, like this golden New Holland. Someone even brought their ferrets along, which was pretty cool.
Oh, he's all right with the horns. A bit nippy, a bit smelly.
After 40 years of basic recession in our industry, where our farm incomes have been falling and falling and falling through various governments' incompetence. We have supermarkets who now dominate every part of our life. They turn the screw on us farmers harder and harder and harder with no restrictions. The government have allowed this. Then we have government doing trade deals all around the world, bringing produce in substandard, grown to inferior qualities, stuff that we cannot use in our industry in this country because we're so regulated. Then it's allowed to be packaged with a union flag on it as British produce because it's packed here. Not grown here, packed here. That's wrong. This all needs changing for us to have a level playing field to be able to survive.
We're on our knees. That's why we're out protesting. That's why we're out in them docks. And when people ask you that question, you tell them, we fed this country affordably, seasonally and healthily since day dot. These buildings and these people wouldn't be here without us. They destroyed everything. Do not let them destroy our industry. We're proud, we're hardworking, and we pay our taxes, and we have done across the board. They don't understand that people are not making a profit.
We're going to talk briefly about my favourite development since the last protest. The government haven't changed their position at all, but it has been undermined a little bit. We saw in the last video that the government say this will only affect 500 farms a year, that the threshold is actually 3 million and not 1 million. And we saw Steve Reed say to a parliamentary committee that we were all protesting because we're too stupid to understand the numbers and we all hate the Labour Party. That is the government's line. But the government's maths was challenged by the Country Land and Business Association, known as the CLA, and BBC Verify looked into the dispute. On the 1st of November, they cited Dan Neidle as an independent tax expert who backs the government's 3 million figure by including all of the nil rate bands, and also the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which said the changes will affect a remarkably small number of some of the most valuable farms. The BBC backed the government citing these people. And then the government rested upon this, explicitly pointing to the BBC article as justification for what they were doing. At the G20 summit, the Prime Minister said, all of you can check out what that means in terms of the impact. I think the BBC has already done it. But just as the government tied the credibility of its calculations to this BBC Verify article, it all started to fall apart. I had to use the Wayback Machine, which lets you look at historical internet pages to show you this article, because the BBC changed it. It now says Dan Neidle is the founder of the Independent Tax Policy Associates. Because he isn't an independent tax expert, he is a member of the Labour Party's National Constitutional Committee. This made BBC Verify look a bit silly. But then, just as he had humiliated the BBC and he had the intellectual credibility of the Labour government resting upon his mighty shoulders, aggressively fighting the government position on Twitter against all of the uneducated farmers, Dan Neidle changed his mind. On the 24th of November, he wrote, "New data shows the budget hits farmers too hard and tax avoiders too lightly. It needs to change." He expands this on the website of his think tank, Tax Policy Associates. People who aren't farmers will keep using farmland as an inheritance tax planning vehicle, comparatively unaffected by the budget. And he then suggests the government protect real farmers with a complete exemption from inheritance tax, subject to a very large cap, say £20 million, at the same time counter avoidance by clawing back the exemption if a farmer's heirs sell the farm. This could achieve the government's aims in a way that's both fairer and more effective, and plausibly raise about the same amount of revenue. I completely agree with this. It would allow me to farm my family's land knowing I would be able to do so into the future. But if we were to sell the farm, we'd be smacked with a massive tax clawing back the exemption. But we wouldn't be farmers at that point. I can't argue with that. And I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies have quietly changed their mind as well. Although they maintain they broadly agree with the government's maths, they think it hasn't been thought out all that well. They conclude that the government could make lifetime gifts of agricultural property before a certain future date inheritance tax free. Or in other words, keep the tax, but let everybody off. While we're on the subject, BBC Verify reminds me of a Stuart Lee joke, where he mocks comedians for starting a story in stand-up and then saying, "And this is true." Because at that point, in the audience, you're sitting there thinking, well, that means the last story wasn't true. With BBC Verify, you're watching the news and then they go over to the special desk where they've actually looked into the issue and tell you things that are actually true, which surely just undermines the credibility of the rest of BBC News. I am trying to talk through history on this channel, although we keep getting distracted, but we have seen that the global political situation looked dicey in 1936. So the government re-implemented the War Agricultural Executive Committees so we wouldn't starve if there was a war. And there was a war. I don't think the planet has been as politically unstable as it is now since 1945. I think the government should re-implement the War Ags to make sure that we can survive if things go wrong. And I don't say that as a joke. There could not be a worse time to dismantle the food system. The government are risking uniting everyone against them. Farmers and their NFU, landowners and their CLA, and urban environmentalists upset about the freezing of the capital grant payments. Farmers, the aristocracy and the George Monbiot's of this world are uniting into the most unholy coalition I have ever seen. These three groups of people have different cultures and opposing interests. They generally hate each other, but they are uniting against this government, which shows just how terrible their management of the countryside is. And I add that while the Labour Party can point to Jeremy Clarkson and point to James Dyson as wealthy figureheads of this opposition to the inheritance tax, if something doesn't change soon, you're going to see old boys topping themselves so the farm can pass on before the tax is introduced in 2026. Who wouldn't give a year or two of their life to stop their children being saddled with debt and forcing their grandchildren to grow up in poverty? And then those people will be the face of it. There'll be an 18-year-old lad who's forced to sell up and has his future robbed from him because his dad unexpectedly died in a car accident. These policies will cause terrible things, and this government will get the blame. The message from this protest was that we are united and this will not go away. I encourage farmers all over the country to organise similar rallies. Don't annoy the public, but put on a show. Have some local farmers give speeches, show off your tractors, make some donations to charity. And if you're a member of the public, get involved. We just want goodwill. Have a look to see if there's any charity tractor runs near you as the festive season approaches, where people decorate their tractors and have a procession for charity. So thank you for watching this, and thank you for your support. We will keep fighting this until the government gives us the respect that we deserve.
When we go home tonight, we'll go back to working hard, to making sure there's food on them shelves. I don't want to go out and protest again. I've had a bellyful. And these bastards don't understand. They are biting the hand that feeds them. Let's pull together from all corners of this country and show them what the countryside can really do. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.